The once small British Empire became known in the 15th century, and it was around this time that it gained fame for its first monastery. Exactly 500 years ago, Europe was shocked by a terrible scandal involving a resident of Littlemore in Oxford, a county in England. What happened there? You will find out later, but be warned, it's something horrific. Here it remains to be added only that this dirty story has been confirmed by archaeological excavations made in our days. The remains of women have been discovered, one of whom had her head smashed in, and another was buried with a child. What on earth was going on there? Let's go. How did this monastery come about? The Littlemore Nunnery was built in Oxford in 1245. Interestingly, from the very beginning of its existence, the spiritual atmosphere there was far from ideal. The place was known to be dangerous, and it is most likely that the builders preferred to save on materials as the first nuns settled there, hoping that the ceiling would not collapse on them. After that, very unpleasant rumors about Littlemore began to spread among the pilgrims. Traveling across Britain, they told everyone they met that the abbess of the monastery offered pilgrims a place to stay and then charged them huge fees. Where could they go? Their need and lack of accommodation was the #1 reason for the nuns' indecent commercial activities. But here, the story is about the years of peak development of violations of the monastic charter from 1517 to 1518. It was then that, due to the nuns' complaints about cruelty, the Pope and the King of the United Kingdoms, united by the Union, sent a certain bishop and inspector from among the nuns. Getting acquainted with all the devilry there in just a few days, he simply went crazy, as it turned out from the conversations that in the monastery premises, young residents, almost girls, played with boys in the women's abode. And there were even more shocking cases that were later widely publicized, first in Britain and then throughout Europe, when the sisters engaged in debauchery with men from the nearest settlement as payment for repair work. Having gotten used to this, the nuns gradually turned their abode into a professional brothel. The local villages eventually became aware of what was going on there. It turns out that while the monks did not complain about their senior sister to those in charge, the whole of Littlemore in the designated location was known for its cruelty, who had sexual relations with local men in chains. But the ladies who found themselves in poverty and in a crumbling building did not shy away from what they had done. Those who isolated them in such a cruel way freed them by breaking the chains. Wells, by the way, was the name of the abbess who was subjected to torture, as were those with whom she had sinned, even though Sister Catherine had an illegitimate daughter from her lover. This connection encouraged her to go further. That aunt wanted to somehow stop what could no longer be stopped, the transformation of a pious place into a brothel. But the inspector saw little children everywhere. Richard Hughes, the priest from Kent, did not hide from the guests, walking with his underage daughter in shameful circumstances. The bishop inspector, after a few days, was forced to officially summon the abbess to court. The trial took place later in Lincoln, from where the abbess had such power, because almost all the nuns were against her. It turns out that she was the unofficial wife of the priest from Kent, who had strong connections here. They had property-related sins. The said person stole church property to provide her daughter with a decent dowry. Of course, not the very objects of art made of precious metals, but the money obtained from the sale of stolen sacred objects. And later, realizing that they were no worse, the other sisters began to sell other, less valuable church utensils. And in general, the women lived in a small room, having rented out all the others. Then they started selling wine and even food supplies, exchanging them for work on the arrangement, firewood, and protection of the almshouse from the people's anger, which had been accumulating since the 10th century. If the senior nun had treated her subordinates well, no one would have taken all this numerous dirt out of the house. Only the increase in punishments caused a loud reaction throughout the country. In our days, scientists have unearthed 90 skeletons under the floor of the monastery church. 28 of them were male, 35 female, and 29 were so badly disintegrated that it was impossible to determine their gender. Among these bone artifacts is the burial of a lady with a broken head, next to whom a woman was buried with the body of an infant. There was also a rather mysterious burial of a girl under 25 years old, who was simply laid face down. It is known for certain that in the Middle Ages, they did this with corpses only in the case of heretics or even witches. What punishment awaited the guilty? The monks did not complain about constant beatings and cruel punishments without reason. In 8 years of managing the monastery, numerous complaints about the cruelty of the abbess accumulated, who, as you already know, herself had an illegitimate connection with one of the priests who arrived from Kent. As a result, only in 1525, the punishment caught up with the ladies, and it consisted only in the closure of the almshouse discussed here. But Sister Catherine received at least a rent of 13 shillings and 6 pence. At the trial, she first denied any accusations against her, even from that case when she gave her beloved canon, a member of the main council of priests of some state, a small silver plate and a paten. Then she confessed, explaining that she decided to sell them to warn the nuns and the priest, whom she decided not to involve in the investigation, stating that she loved him and he was not guilty. The simple sisters did not receive any severance pay at all, practically continuing their poverty. Dead bodies, traces of their own monastery disputes, or the fruit of a reaction to everything that was happening. After 1525, the year of the scandalous trial, all the monastic buildings ended up in the hands of Cardinal Wolsey, the main deputy of the Pope in his country. This Briton planned to build a college on this foundation, but he never realized his intention. The complex remained abandoned, inhabited by memories for several centuries. Only in the only surviving object of the cult complex, in the annex, a pub called Priory appeared. Misfortune continued to envelop the place. In 2013, the pub became a victim of an attack by a large gang of football hooligans. Since then, this address has not been of any interest. The story of the Littlemore Nunnery is not an isolated incident. In various periods and places, convents and monasteries have been associated with sexual misconduct and scandal. In medieval Italy, for instance, there were rumors of convents doubling as brothels, where nuns would entertain wealthy patrons or influential men. These allegations were often difficult to prove, but they contributed to the perception of convents as places of moral corruption. The 20th century saw a shift in attitudes towards sexuality, and this was reflected in the lives of some nuns. In the 1960s and 1970s, a small but significant number of nuns began to question the traditional vows of chastity, advocating for a more open and accepting view of human sexuality. This movement, often associated with the broader women's liberation movement, challenged the Church's teachings on sexual morality and the role of women in religious life. Nuns have also been the subject of erotic literature and art. In the 18th century, a genre of literature known as nun erotica emerged, featuring stories of nuns engaged in sexual adventures. These works were often written by men and reflected a fascination with the perceived sexual repression of nuns. Despite their controversial nature, these stories contributed to the popular imagination of nuns as sensual, passionate women.